My mother humiliated me in front of 50 people, calling me jealous for questioning my sister's pregnancy. She didn't realize I'd already invited the one person who could prove my sister's belly was nothing more than an expensive accessory. The garden smelled of white lilies and cheap deception. Chloe preened in her silk maternity dress while our mother held court. "Elena just can't stand not being the center of attention," Mom whispered loudly to the aunts. I stayed silent, mentally reviewing the $12,000 catering bill I'd quietly settled that morning. It's a specific kind of cruelty, isn't it? When a family uses the word jealousy to bury your intuition. If you've ever had your common sense framed as a character flaw just to protect a golden child, you know exactly why I stopped trying to be the good daughter. When the visiting nurse walked through the gate, Chloe's face turned a translucent, sickly white. Why would a pregnant woman look at a medical professional with such pure, unadulterated terror? To understand why I was standing in a manicured garden listening to my mother dismantle my character, you have to understand the architecture of our family. In the Reynolds household, there was a very specific currency: fragility. Chloe was the primary shareholder. From the time she was 6 and too delicate to help with the dishes, she had mastered the art of being the person things happened to. She didn't fail classes, the teachers didn't understand her spirit, she didn't lose jobs, the managers were intimidated by her potential. And my mother, Diane, was the tireless curator of this museum of excuses. I was the opposite. I was the sturdy one, the one who didn't need a coat in the winter, the one who worked through college, built a commercial real estate firm from a folding table in a studio apartment, and eventually became the quiet benefactor of the very people who looked down on me for being transactional. Beat, I didn't mind being the bank. I minded being the bank and being told I was lucky to be allowed in the vault. When Chloe announced she was pregnant 6 months ago, the family dynamic shifted from a low-grade annoyance to a full-scale religious event. She had finally achieved the ultimate status in Diane's eyes. She was a vessel of life, a miracle. "She's so high risk, Elena," my mother had whispered to me over the phone when they first asked me to host the shower at the estate I'd purchased for them to live in. "The doctor says she needs total serenity, no stress, no questions." That was the first red flag. In my business, no questions is the universal language for "the books are cooked." I watched Chloe for months. I watched her morning sickness that only seemed to trigger when it was time to carry groceries or discuss the budget for the nursery. I watched her order $400 worth of sushi, the raw kind, and claim her specialist said her body specifically craved the mercury. But the crack in the foundation appeared 3 weeks ago. I was in the kitchen of the estate, checking the plumbing after a leak, when I saw the ultrasound photo pinned to the refrigerator. It was a standard black and white thermal print, a tiny, curled-up life. But at the bottom left corner, there was a date and a clinic name: Street Jude's Maternal Imaging, 2018. Chloe's current pregnancy was supposed to be a 2026 baby. Sigh, I didn't say anything then. I'm a woman who deals in contracts and titles. I know that an accusation without proof is just a gift to your enemy, so I waited. I paid for the $12,000 catering. I paid for the imported lilies. I even paid for the designer maternity gown Chloe was currently wearing, a dress that, I noticed, she had pinned at the waist because her bump was sitting about 2 inches lower than it had been during brunch. As I stood there by the mimosa bar, my mother leaned in close to a group of her friends. Her voice was that practiced, tragic stage whisper she used when she wanted to be overheard. "It's just so sad," Diane said, looking right at me. "Elena has all this professional success, but she's empty inside. She sees Chloe's glow. She sees the way the family has rallied around this baby, and she just can't help herself. She started asking Chloe for her medical records yesterday. Can you imagine? Questioning a pregnant woman's health because you're so desperate for control? The aunts tut-tutted. One of them looked at me with genuine pity, as if jealousy were a terminal illness I was suffering from. I didn't flinch. I just took a sip of my sparkling water and checked my watch. The visiting nurse I'd hired to provide on-site wellness checks for the high-risk guest of honor was due to arrive in exactly 5 minutes. My mother thought she was protecting a miracle. I knew I was just waiting for the audit to begin. I looked at Chloe, who was currently laughing while holding a glass of what looked like very real Prosecco. She caught my eye and blew a kiss, her smile never reaching her eyes. It was the look of a woman who thought she had successfully sold a lie to the person who owned the building. Mrs. Gable arrived exactly as the caterers were bringing out the salmon blinnies. She was a woman in her late 50s, with iron gray hair, and the kind of posture that made people instinctively stand up straighter. She wore navy scrubs and carried a professional medical bag that looked heavy with authority. I stepped toward the center of the garden, raising my hand just enough to catch the light. "Everyone, if I could have a moment," I said, my voice cutting through the chatter of 30 women. We all know how delicate this pregnancy has been for Chloe. My mother has been so worried about the high-risk nature of it all that I couldn't just sit by. So, as my gift to Chloe, I've hired Mrs. Gable. She's a private neonatal specialist. She'll be here for the rest of the afternoon just to monitor Chloe's vitals and make sure the heat and the excitement don't put her or the baby in any danger. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My mother's face went through a fascinating series of spasms. She wanted to be angry, she wanted to scream at me for intruding, but I had framed it as an act of extreme, expensive devotion. To reject a nurse for a high-risk pregnancy in front of 30 witnesses would look like negligence. "Elena," Mom said, her voice strained, "that's incredibly over the top, even for you." "Is it?" I asked, tilting my head. "You told me yesterday her blood pressure was a constant battle. I'd never forgive myself if something happened at an event I hosted." I looked at Chloe. The glow everyone had been complimenting was gone, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat. She clutched her mimosa glass so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. "I'm fine, Elle," Chloe managed, her voice an octave higher than usual. "Really, it's too much. I don't need a nurse." "Nonsense," Mrs. Gable interrupted, her voice a pleasant but firm baritone. She was already moving toward Chloe with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 30 years in a triage unit. "High risk means high risk, dear. Better to be safe. Why don't we just find a quiet corner and do a quick check? Heart rate, blood pressure, maybe a quick Doppler for the little one's heartbeat if you're up for it." The word Doppler hit the air like a gunshot. Chloe's eyes darted to my mother. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty in Diane's expression. It was the look of a woman who had spent so long building a theater that she had forgotten the play wasn't real. "Elena," Mom hissed, pulling me aside while the aunts gathered around Chloe and the nurse. "Stop this. Right now. You're making a scene. You're trying to humiliate her because you can't stand that she's the one with the family. You think because you have the money you get to play doctor?" "I'm paying for safety, Mom," I said, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "If Chloe is as sick as you say she is, Mrs. Gable is a godsend. If she isn't, well, then I've just wasted some money on peace of mind. Why does that bother you so much?" Diane's eyes narrowed. "You're a cold, calculating woman. You've always been like this. Even as a child, you'd rather prove someone wrong than be loved." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I watched as Mrs. Gable led Chloe toward the shaded cabana at the edge of the property. Chloe was walking stiffly, her hand firmly planted on the top of her bump, as if she were trying to hold it in place. I followed them at a distance, far enough to look like a concerned sister, close enough to hear the exact moment the logic began to fail. Mrs. Gable set her bag on the glass table. "Let's start with the blood pressure, Chloe. Give me your left arm." Chloe sat on the edge of the lounge chair, her breathing shallow. As the Velcro of the cuff tightened around her arm, I noticed something that no one else in the room of adoring fans would have seen. Chloe wasn't just nervous, she was checking the exit. She was looking at the driveway, at the gate, anywhere but at the nurse. 110/70, Mrs. Gable murmured, looking at the gauge. "That's perfectly normal. Not high at all for someone in their third trimester in this heat." "It fluctuates," Chloe stammered. "I'm sure it does," Mrs. Gable said. She reached into her bag and pulled out the Doppler, the small device used to hear a fetal heartbeat. "Now, let's hear how the little one is doing. Just lift the top of your dress slightly so I can get the gel on the skin." Chloe didn't move. She didn't lift the dress. She didn't even breathe. I can't," Chloe whispered. "I'm too sensitive today. The skin is too tender. My doctor said no abdominal pressure." "It's a sonic probe, honey. It's less pressure than your own hand is currently applying," Mrs. Gable said, her professional mask starting to show the first sign of a crack. She looked at the way Chloe was holding her stomach, not with the cradling warmth of a mother, but with the desperate grip of someone holding a secret together. I stepped into the cabana, the sunlight at my back. "Chloe," I said softly, "is there a reason you don't want the nurse to touch your stomach?" Chloe looked up at me, and for a second, the mask slipped entirely. It wasn't jealousy she saw in my eyes. It was an audit. "Get away from me, Elena." She spat, the sweetness she'd used all afternoon curdling into a sharp, ugly venom. "You've always wanted to ruin this for me. You've always been jealous of what I have." It was the same script Diane had written for her 20 years ago, but today, the audience included a medical professional who was currently staring at Chloe's midsection with a very strange expression. Mrs. Gable didn't say a word. She just reached out faster than Chloe could react and adjusted the stethoscope around her neck. In the process, her hand accidentally brushed against the side of Chloe's stomach. There was no soft give of flesh. There was the distinct, hollow thump of plastic hitting a hard, molded surface. Mrs. Gable's eyebrows shot up. She looked at me, then back at the high-risk patient who was now trembling with a different kind of intensity. "Miss Reynolds," the nurse said, her voice now devoid of any warmth, "I think we need to have a much more private conversation." I smiled, though it didn't feel like a victory yet. It felt like the first page of a very long, very expensive deposition. "That isn't anatomy, Miss Reynolds." Mrs. Gable didn't whisper it. She said it with the flat, clinical detachment of a woman who had spent 30 years in triage units seeing everything from miracle births to insurance fraud. Chloe pulled back as if she'd been burned, her hands flying up to cover the front of her dress, her breathing now a series of jagged, wet hitches. I have a medical condition," Chloe gasped, her eyes darting around the cabana like a trapped animal. "It's a brace. For my back. The pregnancy is putting a strain on my spine, and I have to wear a molded support," my doctor insisted. It was a pathetic lie. A frantic, desperate reach for a life raft in a sea of rising truth. "A back brace that wraps around the front and sounds like a plastic storage bin?" I asked. My voice felt like ice water in the summer heat. I looked past Chloe to the garden beyond the cabana. There, My mother was laughing with her friends, her head tilted back, her pearls gleaming in the sun. She looked triumphant. She looked like a woman who had successfully curated a perfect life using other people's labor and other people's money. That was the system. In our family, truth wasn't a factual record, it was a consensus. If my mother and Chloe agreed the sky was neon pink, then my insistence that it was blue was labeled as negativity or aggression. I had been the family's resident aggressor for 32 years simply because I had the audacity to remember things as they actually happened. I was the infrastructure, they were the inhabitants. And as long as the infrastructure didn't talk back, the inhabitants could pretend the house built itself. I remembered the year our father died, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a commercial portfolio that was hemorrhaging cash. Chloe was 18, busy finding herself at a boutique college I was paying for. My mother was busy maintaining the illusion of our social standing, ordering new silk linens for a house we were 3 weeks away from losing. I was 22, working 18-hour days to restructure the debt, selling my car, and living on black coffee and spite to keep them in their beds. When I finally saved the estate and bought it outright to ensure they had a permanent home, my mother didn't say thank you. She said, "It's about time you did something for this family, Elena. You've always been so selfish with your time." But this pregnancy was a new level of structural rot. I looked at the nurse. Mrs. Gable was looking at Chloe's bag, a designer diaper bag she'd been carrying like a trophy all afternoon. A corner of a document was peeking out from the side pocket. I stepped forward and, before Chloe could react, I pulled it free. "Elena, stop! That's private!" Chloe screamed, lunging for it. It wasn't a medical record. It was a lease agreement. Specifically, a lease for a luxury penthouse in the city, signed by Chloe and a man whose name I didn't recognize. The security deposit was $30,000. The commencement date was exactly 2 weeks from today. "Where did you get $30,000, Chloe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Chloe looked at the ground, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Mom gave it to me. She said I deserved a fresh start for the baby. She said you wouldn't mind. You have so much, and I have nothing." The air left my lungs. My mother didn't have $30,000. She lived on an allowance I provided. She had no savings, no assets. Everything she owned was held in a trust I controlled. Except for one thing. My father's vintage watch collection. A set of Patek Philippe and Rolexes that were supposed to be held in the family safe until I decided how to distribute them as part of the estate's final settlement. They were worth $250,000. I felt a cold, sharp click in my mind. The jealousy narrative wasn't just to protect Chloe's ego, it was a preemptive strike. If they could paint me as the jealous, unstable sister, any questions I asked about the missing watches or the missing pregnancy could be dismissed as a mental breakdown. I wasn't just being insulted, I was being robbed, and the baby was the distraction. I looked back at the party. My mother was now walking toward us, her smile widening as she saw the group in the cabana. She didn't know the nurse had touched the plastic. She didn't know I had the lease in my hand. She thought she was coming over to deliver the final blow to my reputation. "Is everything all right in here?" Diane asked, her voice dripping with artificial concern as she stepped into the shade. "Chloe, darling, you look pale. Elena, have you been upsetting her again?" I looked at the nurse, then at my sister, and finally at the woman who had spent my entire life teaching me that my value was measured by how much I could absorb without breaking. "Mom," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, "I think you and I need to go into the house and check the safe." My mother didn't flinch. She just sighed. that long, suffering sound she'd used 1,000 times. "See?" she said, turning to the aunts who had followed her. "Always about the money, always about the things." She can't just let her sister have a moment of joy without making it about a transaction. For the first time in my life, the word didn't hurt. It felt like a promotion. If they wanted a transaction, I was more than happy to give them one. I walked toward the French doors of the main house, the heels of my pumps clicking rhythmically against the slate path. It was a sound of industry, of progress, the sound of the woman who kept the lights on. Behind me, I could hear the rustle of silk and the hushed, frantic whispers of my mother and sister. They were trying to coordinate a story in the 10 seconds it took to cross the threshold. Inside, the house was cool and smelled of expensive citrus. I'd bought this place 3 years ago when Diane claimed her knees couldn't handle the stairs in her old condo. I had filled it with custom cabinetry, heated floors, and a state-of-the-art security system. I thought I was buying her dignity. In reality, I was just furnishing a crime scene. As we reached the foyer, I didn't head for the kitchen or the parlor. I went straight for the study, the room where the heavy floor safe sat behind a false panel of books. "Elena, stop this theatrical nonsense," Diane snapped, her voice echoing in the hallway. "You're ruining your sister's day. You've already involved a stranger in our private business. Isn't that enough of a win for you?" I stopped and turned. "A win? Mom, look at the math. I've spent the last decade making sure your lives are comfortable. When Chloe wanted to start over in San Diego, I paid the moving costs and the 6 months of rent she eventually defaulted on. When you wanted the European cruise to clear your head after Dad's anniversary, I didn't just buy the ticket. I paid for the wardrobe you said you needed to feel respectable." "Those were gifts," Chloe cried, clutching her stomach, the plastic stomach, as if it were a shield. "No, Chloe. Those were investments in a piece that doesn't exist," I said, and I started noticing the patterns long ago. Like last Christmas, when I noticed the heirloom silver tea set was missing, you told me it was being professionally cleaned. It never came back. Or 2 years ago, when you asked for an extra $5,000 for property taxes on this house taxes I'd already paid directly from my corporate account. The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of years of small, calculated thefts. It's a peculiar thing, the way a family scapegoat is born. It doesn't happen with one big blow. It's a series of tiny erosions. You're told you're too sensitive when you notice a lie. You're told you're obsessed with money when you ask for a receipt. Eventually, you stop asking because the emotional tax of the conversation is higher than the dollar amount of the theft. They had built their entire lifestyle on that tax. They counted on my exhaustion. "I gave you that money because I'm your mother," Diane said, her chin trembling in a way that usually made me fold. "I have a right to help my other daughter. You have everything, Elena. You have the firm, the car, the reputation. Chloe has nothing. Chloe has a fake pregnancy and a $30,000 lease on a penthouse she can't afford," I countered. "And if she has nothing, it's because she spends her life pretending to be someone who doesn't have to work. You didn't give her that money, Mom. You don't have it. Which means you took something of mine to get it." I reached for the panel and swung it open. The digital keypad of the safe blinked a steady, judging green. I punched in the code my father's birthday, a date I was apparently the only one who still respected. The heavy door creaked open. The velvet-lined drawers that should have held 5 generations of the Reynolds family's horological history were empty. The Patek Philippe with the moon phase dial, the gold Rolex Submariner, even the vintage Cartier tank watch my father had worn every day of my childhood, all gone. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. It wasn't anger. Anger is for people who still expect better. This was something else. This was the sound of the last thread of obligation snapping. I turned back to them. Chloe was leaning against the doorframe, her face a mask of defiant entitlement. Diane looked almost bored, as if my discovery of her theft was merely a tedious formality she had to endure. "I sold them," Diane said simply. "I'm the widow. They were mine to sell." "They were part of the estate trust, Mom. You know that. They were assets meant to be liquidated only if the maintenance of this property failed. They weren't meant to fund Chloe's imaginary life in the city." "Imaginary?" Chloe scoffed, finally dropping the high-risk whisper. "The baby is real enough for the people who matter. I'm moving out. I'm starting a life where I don't have to live under your thumb, Elena, where people actually like me for who I am, not for what I can do for them." The irony was so thick it was almost comedic. She was moving into a life funded by the watches of a man she hadn't visited in the hospital once during his final month. "The baby isn't real, Chloe," I said, stepping closer to her. I could see the seam of the prosthetic through the silk of her dress now. The nurse felt the plastic. "I have the lease in my hand. You're faking a pregnancy to justify a massive payout from Mom, and Mom is stealing from the family trust to keep you from ever having to face the reality of your own failures." I looked at my mother, the woman who had called me jealous in front of my peers less than an hour ago. "You called me jealous," I whispered. "But you weren't describing my feelings. You were describing your own. You're jealous that I grew up to be the person Dad hoped you'd be. You're jealous that I don't need you to survive." Diane didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just straightened her pearls and looked at me with a cold, predatory light in her eyes. "You think you've won because you found the empty box?" she asked. "Elena, you're the one who looks like a lunatic. Who calls a nurse to a baby shower to assault their sister? Who accuses their grieving mother of theft in front of guests? By the time I'm done talking to everyone out there, you won't have a single friend left in this town." I looked at her, and for the first time in 30 years, I realized she had no power over me. She had been playing a game with pieces I had provided. "The guests," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "You're right, Mom. We shouldn't keep them waiting. Let's go back out and tell them the truth together." I walked past them, not waiting for an answer. I wasn't just the bank anymore. I was the auditor, and the grace period was officially over. The sunlight hit me like a spotlight the moment I stepped back onto the patio. The chatter didn't stop, but it shifted. It became that low, vibrating hum of 30 women waiting for the second act of a play they hadn't realized they'd paid to see. I stood at the top of the stone stairs, looking down at the garden. It was beautiful. The white hydrangeas, the silk ribbons, the sterling silver cake servers. I had built this world for them. I had curated this piece, and as I looked at my mother and Chloe trailing behind me, I realized that for them, this wasn't a home or a family event. It was a stage. And I was just the stagehand they were planning to fire. Diane pushed past me, her face already crumpling into a mask of maternal tragedy. She didn't head for her seat, she headed for her inner circle, the 3 most influential women in our social bracket. "I don't know what to do," my mother sobbed, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Elena has finally snapped. She's accusing us. She's making up these horrible things about Chloe. I think she needs professional help." She wasn't just lying. She was attempting a social assassination. In our world, professional help was code for unreliable narrator. If she could label me as mentally unstable, my business contracts, my reputation, and my legal standing over the estate would all be called into question. She wasn't just trying to win an argument. She was trying to seize the keys to the kingdom by burning the queen. I stood there, watching her prepare to lie to 30 women about me, and I felt something in me go stone cold. The last lingering hope that she might one day see me as a daughter instead of a resource vanished. It was the point of no return. I wasn't going to save them anymore. I wonder if you've ever had that moment, that terrifying, liberating second, where you realize the people you've been protecting are the very ones holding the matches to your life. If you've ever had to make the choice to finally stop being the bigger person and just let the truth do its damage, you'll understand why the next 10 minutes had to happen. Give this a like if you're ready to see a golden child's throne finally crumble under the weight of its own lies. "Elena, dear," Aunt Martha said, her voice laced with a terrifying kind of concern as she stepped toward me. "Maybe you should go inside and lie down." The stress of the firm. It must be getting to you. Chloe is so upset. "Chloe is terrified, Martha," I said, my voice projecting clearly over my mother's performative weeping. "But not of me. She's terrified of the nurse I hired." I signaled to Mrs. Gable, who was still standing by the cabana, her medical bag gripped tightly in her hand. She looked like a woman who had seen a ghost, or perhaps just a very expensive piece of fraud. "Mrs. Gable," I called out, "would you mind coming over here? My mother is concerned about my mental health. She thinks I'm making up horrible things about my sister's pregnancy." Chloe tried to make a run for the house, but she was trapped. The guest list was too dense, and she was still encumbered by the plastic shell strapped to her abdomen. She looked like a turtle trying to sprint. "Chloe, stay right there," I said. It wasn't a request. It was the voice I used in a boardroom when a merger was failing. It was a voice that commanded gravity. The garden went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. My mother straightened up, her tears drying instantly. "Elena, you are making a fool of yourself. This is a private family matter." "You made it public the second you called me jealous in front of my friends." "Mom," I said, stepping down the first stair. "You made it public when you sold Dad's watches to fund a lie. And you made it public when you invited all these people to celebrate a baby that doesn't exist." A collective gasp rippled through the garden. I saw one of the aunts actually drop her fork. "How dare you?" Diane hissed, her face contorting. "How dare you say that about your sister?" "I'm not saying it, Mom," I said, looking at Mrs. Gable as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "I'm asking a medical professional to describe what she found when she examined the patient." Mrs. Gable looked at the crowd, then at my mother, and finally at Chloe. She was a woman of high integrity, and she clearly hated being part of a circus, but she hated being lied to even more. "I was hired to perform a wellness check on a high-risk pregnancy," Mrs. Gable said, her voice clinical and cold. "What I found was a woman wearing a medical-grade prosthetic bump made of silicone and hard plastic. There was no fetal heartbeat because there is no fetus. I've seen some things in my career, but using a nurse to validate a fake pregnancy? That's where I draw the line." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. It was the sound of 30 reputations being recalculated. It was the sound of a system collapsing. I looked at Chloe. She was shivering in the heat. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the ground, her mind undoubtedly racing to find a new lie, a new angle, a new way to make this my fault. But I was already 3 steps ahead of her. I had already realized that when you stop asking to be loved, you become impossible to control. My verdict was private, final, and absolute. The family I thought I had died a long time ago. This was just the funeral. The exodus was quiet, efficient, and devastating. In the world of old money and new reputations, a scandal of this magnitude isn't met with shouting. It's met with the sound of car doors closing and gravel crunching under tires. Within 20 minutes, the garden was a graveyard of half-eaten cupcakes and abandoned mimosas. Mrs. Gable was the last to leave. She didn't ask for her fee. She just looked at me, gave a single, somber nod of respect, and walked to her car. She knew she'd just provided the testimony of a lifetime. I didn't go back to the garden. I went to the library, locked the door, and opened my laptop. My mother and sister were in the kitchen. I could hear them through the vents. They weren't crying anymore. They were strategizing. I heard Chloe's voice, sharp and frantic. We just tell them she's been faking the medical records. We say Elena pressured the nurse. We say... I stopped listening. Their strategy was based on the old world, the world where I cared what the neighbors thought. My new strategy was based on the one thing they had never bothered to understand: the law. I called Marcus, my lead corporate counsel. It was Saturday, but for the fees I paid him, he answered on the second ring. "Elena? I thought you were at a shower," Marcus said. "The shower is over, Marcus. I need you to pull the filings for the Reynolds Family Trust, specifically the clause regarding the conduct and maintenance of the estate inhabitants." "Is everything okay?" "It will be. I also need you to contact the police department. I want to report a theft of high-value assets, father's watch collection. I have the appraisals and the insurance serial numbers in the cloud. The primary suspect is Diane Reynolds." There was a long pause on the other end. Marcus had been my father's friend before he was my lawyer. He knew the weight of what I was asking. "Elena, if you file that report, there's no taking it back. That's a felony charge given the valuation. Your mother could face real time." "She didn't just steal watches, Marcus. She stole my father's legacy to fund a fraud. She used my money to facilitate a criminal deception. The grace period ended at 2:15 p.m. today." Next, I opened the property management portal for the estate. This house was held in an LLC I owned. My mother didn't have a life estate. She had a license to occupy, a legal distinction I'd insisted on 3 years ago when I noticed her spending habits spiraling. It was a safety net I'd built for her, but today, it was a trap. I drafted a formal notice to quit. In the state of New York, a licensee can have their occupancy revoked with 30 days' notice if they violate the terms of the agreement. Theft from the owner is a pretty standard violation. I sat in the silence of the library, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I felt a strange, cold peace. For years, I had been the one holding the umbrella while they poured water on me. Now, I was simply stepping inside and closing the door. A sharp rap on the library door broke my focus. "Elena, open this door right now." My mother's voice was back to its commanding, imperious tone. She had regained her footing. She probably thought she'd found a way to spin this. I stood up, walked to the door, and unlocked it. Diane stood there, Chloe hovering behind her. Chloe had finally removed the plastic bump. She looked strangely small and deflated in the oversized silk dress, like a child playing dress-up in a theater that had gone dark. "You've had your little tantrum," Diane said, stepping into the room as if she still owned the air in it. "You've embarrassed this family beyond repair. I hope you're satisfied. Now, here is what is going to happen. You are going to call every person who was here today. You are going to tell them you had a lapse, a misunderstanding. You'll tell them Chloe had a phantom pregnancy due to stress, it's a real medical thing, and that you overreacted." I looked at her. I didn't interrupt. I didn't even blink. "And," Diane continued, emboldened by my silence, "you are going to pay for Chloe's new apartment. Since you've ruined her reputation here, she has to move. It's the least you can do after the trauma you've put her through today." "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. "I am, and I expect those calls to be made by Monday." I turned my laptop screen around so they could see the document I had just finished. The header read, "Official notice to quit and vacate premises." "What is this?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. "It's your 30-day notice," I said. "Both of you. This house is being put on the market on the 1st of next month. The locks will be changed on the 31st at noon. Any personal property remaining will be photographed and moved to a storage unit, the fees for which will be deducted from whatever remains of your monthly allowance, which, by the way, has been suspended as of 5 minutes ago." My mother laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You can't evict your own mother, Elena. Think of the optics. You'd be a social pariah." "I'm already a social pariah, Mom. You made sure of that in the garden," I said, leaning back against the mahogany desk. "But here's the difference. I have the deed, I have the law, and I have the records of the watches you sold. Marcus is filing the police report as we speak." The color drained from Diane's face so fast it was like watching a candle go out. "The watches?" she whispered. "The Patek, the Rolexes, the Cartier. I know which jeweler you used, Mom. I know how much you got for them. And I know exactly which account you moved the money into to pay for Chloe's penthouse deposit." I stood up and walked toward them. They both flinched. It was a small movement, but it told me everything. They weren't powerful. They were just bullies who had run out of victims. "You have 30 days to figure out how to be adults," I said. "I suggest you start by looking for a job. I hear the catering company I hired today is looking for extra hands to scrub floors." I walked past them, out of the library, and down the hall. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could already feel the temperature in the house dropping. The audit wasn't just about the money, it was about the air they were breathing, and I was officially cutting off the supply. The following week was a study in the persistence of delusion. My mother and sister didn't pack a single box. Instead, they spent their days on the phone, spinning a web of lies so thick it started to feel like a second atmosphere in the house. I watched them through the lens of the security cameras I'd installed not out of paranoia, but for documentation. I watched Diane sitting at the mahogany dining table, her voice hushed and tragic, calling every member of the St. Jude's Hospital Board of Trustees. "She's been working too hard," Diane would say, her eyes welling up for an audience that wasn't there. The pressure of the firm. "She's developed this obsessive, paranoid streak. She's attacking Chloe, attacking me. We're terrified for her." It was a brilliant move, in a desperate sort of way. I was the chair of the Reynolds Foundation, which provided 40% of the funding for the hospital's new pediatric wing. If Diane could convince the board I was mentally incompetent, she could invoke the succession of control clause in my father's original bylaws. She wasn't just trying to stay in the house, she was trying to take the checkbook. I let them do it. I let the rumors fester. I let the concerned emails from the board members pile up in my inbox without a reply. In the world of power, silence is often mistaken for surrender. Diane, fueled by a lifetime of getting away with small crimes, mistook my quiet for a breakdown. She became overconfident. She even had the audacity to order a new set of patio furniture on my corporate account, assuming I was too broken to check the statements. I wasn't broken. I was busy. I spent those 3 days in a windowless room at my firm with a team of forensic accountants and a private investigator. We didn't just look at the watches, we looked at everything. We found the charity auctions Diane had hosted where the proceeds never reached the charities. We found the educational grants Chloe had received from the Foundation for a master's degree she'd never even applied for. Every lie had a paper trail. Every theft had a date, a time, and a signature. On Wednesday, the board of the Memorial Hospital called an emergency meeting. The agenda was governance and leadership stability. Code 4, we need to decide if Elena Reynolds is too crazy to sign the checks. I arrived at the boardroom 10 minutes late. It was a deliberate choice. I wanted them to feel the tension. I wanted Diane and Chloe, who were already seated at the long oak table, to feel the first brush of victory. Diane was wearing her grieving but brave outfit, black silk, modest pearls, and a look of practiced exhaustion. Chloe sat beside her, looking pale and fragile, clutching a box of tissues. To anyone who didn't know the texture of their souls, they looked like the victims of a high-powered, cold-hearted corporate shark. Elena, the board president, Arthur Vance, said as I walked in. His voice was heavy with the discomfort of a man who hated messy emotions. Thank you for joining us. Given the concerns raised by your mother regarding your recent behavior at the baby shower, we felt it was necessary to discuss the Foundation's leadership. I didn't sit down. I walked to the head of the table, placed my leather briefcase on the wood, and looked at my mother. She gave me a small, pitying smile. It was the smile of a woman who thought she'd finally found a way to make me the support act. I understand, I said, my voice calm and resonant. It's important that the board has full transparency. My mother has raised concerns about my obsessive behavior. She believes I've unfairly targeted my sister. Is that correct, Diane? I just want you to get better, Elena. My mother whispered, dabbing at her eyes. The way you treated Chloe, the things you said about her baby. It was just so cruel. And the watches, Mom? I asked. You told the board I accused you of stealing Dad's collection? It's heartbreaking, Diane said to the room. She knows I would never touch her father's things. I opened my briefcase and pulled out 12 identical blue folders. I began sliding them down the table, one for each board member. In those folders, I said, you will find the high-definition surveillance footage from Gold and Time Jewelers on 47th Street. It shows my mother, Diane Reynolds, selling my father's Patek Philippe and 3 Rolexes on the afternoon of the 14th. You will also find the bank records showing that the $180,000 she received was immediately transferred into a private account held by my sister, Chloe. The air in the room didn't just go cold, it vanished. And since we're discussing cruelty, I continued, my voice gaining a razor-edged precision, you'll find the sworn affidavit from Mrs. Gable, the neonatal nurse. She details exactly how Chloe Reynolds used a $400 silicone prosthetic to feign a pregnancy for 6 months to secure maternal support funds from this very board's endowment. Arthur Vance opened his folder. His face went through a series of colors, from pale to a deep, embarrassed crimson. The other board members followed suit. The sound of pages turning was the only noise in the room. I looked at Chloe. She was staring at the folder in front of her as if it were a bomb. My mother had stopped crying. Her face had hardened into something ugly and ancient. The overconfidence that had sustained them for a week was evaporating, leaving behind nothing but the raw, shivering reality of their own greed. I'm not the one who is unstable, Arthur, I said, leaning over the table. I'm the one who's been subsidizing a fraud. And as of this moment, the Reynolds Foundation is withdrawing all funding for the pediatric wing until this board can prove they didn't knowingly facilitate my sister's high-risk embezzlement. I wasn't just shifting the board, I was flipping the table. I looked at my mother, whose mouth was hanging open in a silent, jagged O. You wanted to talk about my character, Mom? I asked. Let's talk about yours, in front of every person whose respect you actually care about. The reckoning hadn't just arrived, it had moved in. The silence in the boardroom was no longer uncomfortable, it was lethal. It was the kind of silence that precedes a verdict in a high-stakes trial. Arthur Vance looked down at the photograph of my mother at the jewelry counter, then up at me, then finally at Diane. His face was a mask of aristocratic distaste. In his world, you can be many things: greedy, arrogant, even cruel, but you can never, ever be caught being common. And theft, especially the kind involving a pawn shop and a fake pregnancy, was as common as it got. "Diane," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave into a register of cold, institutional judgment. "Is this true? Did you liquidate estate assets held in trust to fund this?" He gestured vaguely toward Chloe, who was currently shrinking into her expensive leather chair. My mother took a breath. I could see her internal gears grinding, trying to find a path through the wreckage. She went for the only card she had left, the tragic matriarch. "Arthur, you've known me for 20 years, she said, her voice trembling with a practiced, liquid vulnerability. I was desperate. Chloe was in a dark place. Elena has always been so hard, so unforgiving. I thought if I could just give Chloe a little bit of the security Elena has, if I could help her build a life, I was going to replace the watches. It was a temporary measure. Mothers do things for their children that others can't understand." "With money that wasn't yours?" Arthur asked. "From a foundation dedicated to sick children?" "Diane, the maternal health grant Chloe received was approved based on medical records you submitted. Records that, according to this forensic report, were digitally altered from a 2018 file." He turned a page in the blue folder. "You didn't just lie to your daughter. You lied to this institution. You committed wire fraud." The word fraud hung in the air like a guillotine. Chloe finally broke. She didn't cry the way she did at the baby shower, the soft, pretty tears meant to garner sympathy. This was a jagged, ugly sound. She turned on our mother with a ferocity that made the board members recoil. "I told you she'd find out," Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking. "I told you Elena monitors the accounts. You said she was too busy with her precious firm to notice a few watches. You told me the board wouldn't check the ultrasound because they respected the Reynolds name. This was your plan, Mom. You're the one who bought the bump. You're the one who told me to pretend the nurse was my idea." "Chloe, shut up," Diane hissed, her mask finally slipping. Her face was no longer that of a grieving widow or a concerned mother. It was the face of a cornered predator. "I did this for you. I did this so you wouldn't have to beg your sister for every cent like I do." "You don't beg, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through their bickering like a scalpel. "You steal, and you do it while calling me the villain. You built a narrative that I was the jealous, cold-hearted outsider, so that no one would listen when I pointed out the rot in this family. You used my sister's laziness and your own entitlement to create a fiction, and you expected me to pay for the printing." I looked around at the board members. These were people I had served with for years. They were seeing the Reynolds family's inner sanctum for the first time, and it was a mess of theft, resentment, and pathetic amateur theater. "The nurse wasn't an accident," I continued, addressing the board. "I hired Mrs. Gable because I knew Chloe wouldn't be able to resist the performance. I knew that if I gave her a stage, she would eventually trip over the props. The fact that she did it at a shower I paid for, in front of the very people you were trying to scam, was just poetic justice." Arthur Vance closed his folder with a sharp thud. He looked at the two women across from him with a look of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. "Diane, Chloe, I think you should leave," Arthur said. "The board will be moving into an executive session to discuss legal referrals. Elena, we will need your full cooperation with the auditors." "You have it," I said, along with the names of the jewelers and the bank routing numbers for the offshore account Chloe was using for her penthouse fund. My mother stood up. She tried to maintain her dignity, but her hand was shaking so badly she couldn't clasp her handbag. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw something that looked like genuine fear. It wasn't because she was sorry. It was because she realized that the sturdy daughter, the one who always absorbed the blow, was gone. "You've destroyed everything, Elena," Diane whispered. "Your father would be ashamed of you." "My father," I said, standing up to meet her gaze, "is the one who taught me that a contract is only as good as the people signing it. You broke the contract, Mom. I'm just enforcing the penalties." As they walked out of the boardroom, their heels clicking on the marble floor sounded hollow. They weren't the golden child and the matriarch anymore. They were just two women who had run out of other people's money. I sat back down. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt a profound sense of lightness, the kind you only feel when you finally put down a weight you were never meant to carry. The reckoning wasn't about the public humiliation, though that was certainly part of it. The reckoning was about the truth becoming the only thing left in the room. And for the first time in my life, the truth was on my side. The audit of a human life always has a body count. For my mother and sister, the cost was measured in the sudden, violent evaporation of their status. For me, the cost was quieter, but no less absolute. By Friday, the house I had bought to protect them felt like a museum of things that no longer belonged to anyone. The white hydrangeas in the garden had wilted, and the catering company had sent a final, stinging invoice for the unreturned silverware that had somehow disappeared during the chaos of the baby shower. Marcus called me while I was sitting in my car in the driveway, watching two men in uniform carry a sofa out of the front door. "The hospital board has officially filed for the restitution of the $60,000 in maternal health grants," Marcus said, his voice sounding tired. "They're also handing over the altered medical records to the district attorney. Diane is looking at felony forgery and grand larceny. Chloe." Well, Chloe is being named as a co-conspirator. "The jeweler on 47th Street has already identified your mother from the security stills. He's cooperating to avoid being charged with receiving stolen goods." "What's the move, Marcus?" I asked. "They want a deal, Elena. Your mother's lawyer called me an hour ago. She's willing to sign over her remaining interest in the family trust, the small portion your father left her directly, in exchange for you dropping the private theft charges and requesting leniency from the DA. She's scared. For the first time in her life, she's realizing that being a Reynolds isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card." I looked at the house. It was a beautiful structure, but the foundation was made of lies and my own misplaced sense of duty. "Tell them I'll consider the deal," I said, "but only on one condition. They vacate the property by midnight on Sunday. No extensions. No emotional luggage. They take their clothes and their personal effects, and they leave the keys on the counter. If I see a single piece of furniture or an heirloom missing, the deal is off, and I'll testify at the grand jury myself." "And the watches?" "The jeweler still has the gold Rolex. The Patek is gone, sold to a private collector in Dubai. Tell my mother that the value of the missing Patek will be deducted from her final trust payout. She'll be leaving with enough to rent a modest apartment in a different zip code, but the life of luxury is over. She's officially retired from the Reynolds name." I hung up and sat in the silence. People think that revenge feels like a firework, a bright, explosive burst of satisfaction. In reality, it feels like a cold rain. It's the feeling of realizing that you were the only one holding the roof up, and now that you've stepped away, everyone is getting wet. I lost more than just money and time. I lost the fiction of a family. I lost the version of my mother that I used to hope for on my birthdays, the one who would look at me and see a person instead of a paycheck. I lost the sister I thought I could eventually save if I just provided enough stability. The phone on my dashboard buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. No apologies. No, I'm sorry for faking a baby. Just, you always were a bitch. I hope you're happy in that big house all by yourself. You bought your win, but nobody loves you. They just fear you. I stared at the screen until it went dark. I wasn't happy. Happiness is a fleeting, sunshine emotion. What I felt was clean. I was alone, yes, but for the first time in 32 years, I wasn't being lied to. I wasn't being robbed while I slept. I wasn't being called jealous by people who were currently wearing my jewelry. The cost of the truth was high. It cost me my childhood home, my social standing in a town full of gossips, and the last shred of my maternal bond. But as I watched the movers close the truck doors, I realized it was a bargain. I'd finally paid off the debt of my own silence, and the receipt was the only thing I needed to carry. The air in Marcus's office was sterile, filtered, and smelled of expensive toner. It was a room designed for the cold disposal of complicated things. Across the mahogany table sat my mother and sister. They looked like the ghosts of their former selves, the designer silk replaced by off-the-rack polyester, the arrogance replaced by a jittery, sallow-eyed desperation. Marcus slid a thick stack of documents toward them. "The separation of interests," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "This document formalizes the termination of Elena's financial responsibility for your living expenses, legal fees, and medical insurance. It also includes a permanent restraining order regarding the Reynolds Foundation and Elena's personal and business properties." "Permanent?" Chloe whispered. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual melodic manipulation. "Elena, you're literally making us homeless." "No, Chloe," I said, leaning forward. I didn't feel the old urge to correct her lie. I only felt the clinical need to clarify the record. "I'm making you independent. I've provided a one-time settlement check, the exact value of the watches Mom stole, minus the legal fees it cost me to clean up your fraud at the hospital. That money is enough for a security deposit and 6 months of rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in the valley. After that, the math is your responsibility." "You're a monster," my mother spat. She didn't have the energy to cry anymore. The tragic matriarch had been retired by the reality of a pending court date. To do this to your own flesh and blood. To let us sink like this while you sit on your millions. "You called me transactional for years, Mom," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "You used that word as a weapon to make me feel small, to make me feel like my only value was what I could provide. Well, I've finally embraced the label. Today, we are finishing the transaction. You sold your relationship with me for a gold Rolex and a fake pregnancy. I've just finished the paperwork on the sale." I watched her hand tremble as she reached for the pen. This was the woman who had dominated my every thought for 3 decades. I had spent so much of my life trying to find the right combination of words, gifts, and silence to make her love me. I had treated her approval like a mountain I had to climb. Now, looking at her, she wasn't a mountain. She was just a woman who had gambled with someone else's heart and lost. The terms were non-negotiable. 1. They would never mention my name to the press or on social media. 2. They would never set foot on the estate again. 3. All communication would go through Marcus. If they breached any of these, the settlement money would be reclaimed through a pre-filed judgment, and I would proceed with the full criminal testimony for the grand jury. I had built a cage of their own making, and I was handing them the bill for the bars. "And what are we supposed to do for work?" Chloe asked, her eyes darting to the check as if it might disappear. "I don't have a degree, Elena. I don't have a resume." "You're very good at theater, Chloe," I said. I suggest you find a career where that's an asset. Or you could try what I did. You could start at the bottom and work until your hands hurt. It's remarkably grounding. Diane signed the last page with a jagged, angry flourish. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. To look at me was to see the person who was no longer absorbing the impact of her choices. She shoved the chair back and stood up, clutching her handbag like a shield. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "When you're old and you have no one, you'll remember the day you threw your family away for a safe full of watches." "I didn't throw you away, Mom," I said, standing up to meet her gaze. "I just stopped paying for the privilege of being your victim. There's a difference." I stayed in the office long after they left. I watched through the window as they walked to the parking lot, arguing with each other before getting into a 10-year-old sedan I'd let them keep. They looked small. They looked common. I turned to Marcus. "Is it done?" "It's done, Elena. You're legally, financially, and emotionally uncoupled." I nodded, feeling the weight of the silence in the room. It wasn't the silence of a void, it was the silence of a clean slate. I had spent my life as a support act for a play that was never worth the ticket price. Now, for the first time, the stage was empty, and I was the one holding the lights. The house sold in 48 hours. The new owners are a young couple from the city doctors, I think. They walked through the garden and commented on how peaceful it felt, how the white lilies seemed to hold the light. I didn't tell them that the soil was packed with 30 years of silent resentment, and that the peace they felt was merely the absence of a long, exhausting war. I stood in the empty foyer one last time, the echo of my own footsteps, the only sound in a space that used to be filled with the noise of other people's demands. It's a strange thing to realize that the person you were taught to be, the sturdy one, the jealous one, the difficult one, was just a character written by people who were too afraid to look at themselves. In the end, my mother was right about one thing. I am transactional. I believe in the fair exchange of value. I gave them decades of my loyalty, my labor, and my silence. In return, they gave me a masterclass in the anatomy of betrayal. The transaction is now complete. I have my life back, and they have the cold, hard reality of their own reflection to keep them company. I've heard through the grapevine that Chloe is working as a receptionist at a mid-tier gym, and Diane is living in a senior apartment complex where no one knows her maiden name or the prestige she once claimed. They tell people I'm the villain. They tell people I'm the cold-hearted daughter who abandoned them in their hour of need. And for the first time in my life, I don't care about the narrative. An unreliable narrator is only dangerous if you're still waiting for them to tell the truth. Once you accept that they are incapable of it, their words become nothing more than background noise. I wonder, looking back on this, if you think I was too ruthless. Some would say that family is a bond that should never be broken, no matter the cost. Others would say that a fire is the only way to clear the brush for new growth. I set the fire, yes, but I wasn't the one who left the matches lying around. This story isn't just a recording of a family feud, it's a case study in the necessity of cold, hard boundaries. If you find yourself in these archives, listening to the way a golden child can be used as a weapon against the one who actually does the work, then you know that survival isn't a team sport. Subscribing here isn't just about entertainment, it's about joining a space where we value the truth over the performance. I walked out the front door and pulled it shut. The click of the lock was final. I didn't look at the rearview mirror as I drove away. I didn't need to see the house, or the garden, or the place where a nurse once exposed a lie that everyone else was too comfortable to notice. I used to think that being loved was the ultimate goal. I was wrong. The ultimate goal is being impossible to control. I am 32 years old. I am financially solvent, and I am entirely alone. And for the first time since I was a child, I can finally hear myself think. It's the most expensive thing I've ever owned, and it was worth every single cent.